and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. I've done a couple of episodes now exploring how the Blitz period affected London through the lens of some of its most famous landmarks like the Tower of London and St Paul's Cathedral. And I really enjoyed these episodes because I find this such an interesting time period and it's a really important part of our urban history. And in researching these episodes, I came across the story of the famed Leningrad Zoo, which survived an incredible 872-day siege during the Second World War. And I really wanted to tell this story. The zoo actually has a really interesting beginning. It was originally founded in 1865 by a Dutch immigrant called Sophia Gerbhardt, who previously found her calling in selling waffles from a cart. She adorned Dutch traditional wares and eventually gained fame and popularity amongst Dutch nobility. And this was an entrepreneurial woman with her fingers in many pies or waffles, you could say. She opened a puppet theatre, a wax museum, a dancing hall, and the Passage department store, which had grown to be very well known around the city. After arriving in the city in 1842, she married a professor of zoology called Julius Gerbhardt in 1848, and it said travelled around the country with his menagerie of animals for around 20 years. In October of 1864, the couple exhibited an armadillo, an Egyptian mongoose, some monkeys, and 2 crocodiles in their shop, as well as successfully petitioned the government to allow them to exhibit a 14-year-old albino girl to customers in the shop, which was probably quite a popular thing at the time. It's thought these business activities lay the foundations for them to lobby the government's permission to establish a permanent public zoo in the city. And it seemed like the city was ready for an establishment like this. In 1860, the ornithologist Vasil Radikov called for the opening of the zoo by arguing that these institutions provide palpable evidence of truths discovered by modern biology available to each and every one. Therefore, a proper zoo had to organise public lectures on natural science and be accompanied by a public museum and a library. City officials heeded this advice, granting them the prime real estate in the centre of St. Petersburg in Alexandra Park, and leased it free of charge to them for the next 20 years. The zoo opened on the 1st of August in 1865. It was advertised as a large and stylish space where the public could hang out for a moderate price. The gardens consisted of 42 buildings, housing 70 species of mammals, birds and amphibians. Amongst the 200 animals included the jaguar, leopard, serval, armadillo, antelope and reindeer. The owners encouraged enthusiasts from across the empire to supply it domestic and exotic animals to bolster its collection. Despite this incredible deal on the real estate, the city hadn't provided the subsidy that the zoo was banking on, and so it struggled financially. And in 1871, Julius died of cholera. By 1873, the zoo was almost bankrupt. But things started to take a turn when Sophia remarried Ernst Rost, who was a successful businessman who owned a theatre, restaurant and carnival on the same grounds as the animal exhibitions. And seriously, where is she finding all these successful businessmen from? Slay for her. His theatre was really popular in the city as it was known for what was described as ethnographic concerts. I'm not sure what that really entails, but it brought together cultures from around the world to showcase their songs, dances, traditional wares and music. This is part of the popularity of the zoo. In researching this episode, I found that the zoo was the centre of the Romanov Empire and was a symbol of political power, scientific development and technical ability to collect and exhibit the world's animals. As Jonathan Schneer observed with reference to the British Empire, perhaps nowhere was London's identity as a resident of an imperial metropolis more subtly or fully confirmed than at the zoo in Regent's Park. The creation of the zoo reflects the significance of zoos in the 19th century, where residents can feel themselves as residents of an imperial capital. The visitors could witness that humans were masters and tamers of nature, and animals were their subjects. As the fame and revenues grew, the zoo achieved sponsorship and some real material upgrades, including running water, sewage, and electricity, which would have been a luxury for people at the time. The authorities did soon caught onto this, and the rent increased. Ross could not keep up with the payments and eventually sold the zoo to move back to Germany. By the early 1900s, the zoo was in disrepair and the animals were neglected and were transferred to Moscow Zoo. The park got new ownership in 1910 and some support from the city, and by the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, it was a popular attraction once again. One of the first moves under the new Bolshevik government, was to nationalise the zoo in 1917. There was an ambitious plan to develop and reorganise the zoo, new buildings were constructed and an academic committee was formed. to teach the youth a biology programme that actually still exists to this day. Now let's get to the zoo under the siege. Moscow became Leningrad after Lenin's death in 1924, and so the zoo became Leningrad Zoo. The Leningrad blockade was one of the most destructive blockades in blockade history. It began on the 8th of September 1941 and went on for 872 days. An estimated 1.5 million people died, and if it had happened today, it would be considered a war crime due to the systematic starvation of the civilian population. The winter of 1941 and 42 was severe, killing many with its freezing temperatures and lack of access to food, but the work at the zoo did not stop. Workers selflessly made efforts to save the 160 animals left at the zoo, but it was a difficult task with enemy missiles and shells raining down on the city. Electricity was shut down and water mains were disconnected and the sewage system was shut off, and it was a very difficult situation. As the siege began, workers saved what they could, sending 80 animals, including panthers, tigers, polar bears and rhinos, urgently to Kazan. But many of the remaining large predators were shot. About 60 workers were stuck in Belarus, having visited to set up an exhibition there. They tried to save what they could, including an American crocodile, who just couldn't be taken due to the conditions needed to transport him. The crocodile was eventually released into the Zapernaya River, Dvina River, but to this day its fate remains unknown. The following is taken from the website on museum studies about the event. The siege was distressing at the time for animals. They ran about their cages in horror. The bear cubs shrieked with fear and the birds took refuge in the corner of the aviary. But the chamees, a species of goat antelope from Eurasia, for some reason climbed to the top of the hill and stood there and waited for the end of the missile strike. The trained bear and the foxes also died that night. The walls of the monkey cages were destroyed, and because of this, the primates were scattered throughout the district. In the morning, shaking from fear, the caretakers gathered the primates from around the city. The bison fell into a shell crater, and nobody had the strength to pull the bison out, so they built a ramp and tried to lure the bison out with pieces of hay by spreading it from the bottom to the edge of the pit. Another night, a goat and a couple of deer were wounded. An employee named Konovalova bandaged the animals and shared her own bread with them and put them back on their feet. However, the poor man died during another shelling, which also took the lives of tiger and large buffalo. Betty was an elephant that was brought to the zoo with Beauty the hippo in 1911. Betty met with a tragic end during an air raid on September the 8th, with one of 3 explosive devices dropped by the German bombers exploding right next door to her, hitting a guard and fatally injuring Betty. It took 15 minutes for the elephant to pass away in the ruins of her refuge, and her funeral was held in the zoo. Her friend Beauty had a difficult time but miraculously survived the siege. She needed up to 40 kilograms of food per day, but could only be afforded 6 kilograms of grass, fleshed out by sawdust. The oars weren't great, as hippos must be constantly soaked in water, otherwise their skin will dry out and crack all over their body, and as the city's water pipes had stood still by the winter of 1914, things weren't looking great for Betty. Things weren't looking great for Beauty. It was down to the selfless work of Yevdokia Dashina, who would carry 40 kilograms of barrels of water on a sled from the Neva River, warming the water and pouring it over the hippo's skin. She lived on through the bombardment and eventually died of old age in 1951. In a bid to save the vegetarian animals, the workers gathered acorns and berries and turned the land into vegetable gardens. The meat eaters had a more difficult time, with tigers refusing meals and the bears living off vegetables. Workers found a way to stave off starvation by concocting meat-like meals, mixing grass with cabbage leaves and coating it with fish oil. Amazingly, the Leningrad Zoo only needed to close during the winter of 1941 to 1942. By spring, the overworked employees cleared the paths and repaired the aviaries in order to reopen the zoo by summer, and during that summer, over 7,400 Leningradians came to see over 160 animals exhibited in the zoo, proving to be a much-needed refuge for the residents during those terrible years. There were only about 24 caretakers who worked relentlessly, refused to leave their posts and sleeping at the zoo, but saving many lives. 16 employees were awarded the Medal for Defense of Leningrad, and later when Leningrad changed its name to St. Petersburg after the fall of the USSR, it was later decided not to change the name of the Leningrad Zoo in order to preserve the memory of the heroism of the staff during the blockade. And today, the zoo is thriving in the heart of St. Petersburg and is home to more than 3,000 animals and 600 species. And that's it for today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There's nothing like some stories of perseverance and bravery to inspire us all. If you'd like to give us a like and subscribe, I bring out new episodes every Tuesday. And if you have any more amazing stories on the theme of urban history or wartime urban history, then please comment them down below, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.